had it the story in his head for 10 years,
Mm.
and then he wrote it in about 4 months, and it's an incredibly complex, layered narrative, but there was I talked to him a little bit afterwards, and I was working on my first novel that ended up going in the drawer, but he was so humble, and he just said, "I'm just lucky." And, a couple of weeks later, he won the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, clearly.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Without These Books. I'm your host, Allison Roach. Without These Books is a thank you inspired video podcast that celebrates the authors, books, and characters that changed us as writers, readers, and as people. So, on our show today, we have S. Kirk Walsh. She is a writer living in Austin, Texas. Her work has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times Book Review, Longreads, StoryQuarterly, and Electric Literature. Over the years, she has been a resident at Ucross, Yaddo, Ragdale, and Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. Additionally, she is the founder of Austin Batcave, a writing and tutoring center that provides free writing workshops for young writers all throughout Austin. The Elephant of Belfast is her first novel. So, what is the book that you chose to talk about today?
It's Lost in the City by Edward P. Jones, which is his first story collection. Um, People may know him more from The Known World because it won the Pulitzer Prize, but Lost in the City is a book that inspired parts of the writing of my novel that is coming out today.
Yay! So, how did it influence the writing of your novel?
Well, I would say a few different ways. There is one story in particular in Lost in the City. It's the opening story called The Girl Who Raised Pigeons. And it's a beautiful, tragic,
Mhm.
complicated story of a young girl who keeps pigeons on the rooftop of her apartment building. And her mother died in childbirth. And yeah, the pigeons symbolize lots of different freedoms, but mostly how he creates a vitality just by the presence of these birds. It doesn't always go well for the birds, unfortunately, but it was a story that I was thinking about when I was writing my book because one of the primary relationships in The Elephant of Belfast, as the title suggests, is between a young woman and an elephant, and trying to examine the emotional complexity of the relationship. And I just read Edward P. Jones's story again and again just to sort of look at the nuances. And he is one of my favorite living writers. And one of the reasons why is he's so good at having the past, present, and future kind of ride on the same line of
Right.
his characters and scene. And that's true of this story. It's true of almost everything he writes, but he really is. I think for me, he's sort of someone that I aspire to. I probably will never be as good of a writer as him, but just how he kind of shows the tragedy and the heartbreak of his characters, but at the same time, there's always a little hope and optimism. And I think for me, my story
Mhm.
it's pretty sad, but I tried to kind of stitch in
Right.
kind of hope, and reading his story was and his work in general. I just love his writing, and
Totally. So,
yeah,
what was the timeline of reading this story and it influencing you? Because you said you read it over and over again. Did you read it once and then you decided to write this, or did you think about
no,
it? Or
yeah. So what happened for me, I think lots of different people are introduced to Edward P. Jones in different ways. So I was introduced to him when The Known World came out. At the time, I was living in New York City, and I went to Barnes and Noble to a reading, and he was he's kind of famously known with The Known World that he had it the story in his head for 10 years,
Mm.
and then he wrote it in about 4 months, and it's an incredibly complex, layered narrative, but there was I talked to him a little bit afterwards, and I was working on my first novel that ended up going in the drawer, but he was so humble and he just said, I'm just lucky. And, a couple of weeks later, he won the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, clearly he's a genius. Um, but I was inspired to pick up Lost in the City after that reading. I wanted to read his other work. And I would say I've been reading the story before I started my novel. I started The Elephant of Belfast in about 2013. And yeah, that story, and there's a story by Anthony Doerr called The Deep. And those were two stories that I found myself kind of like s- teaching stories for myself in
Right.
terms of what I was trying to return to in terms of animating complexity in character and scene. And The Deep is set in kind of turn of the century Detroit, Anthony Doerr's story. And that was sort of, um, yeah, just sort of how to bring immediacy to a historical narrative. But with Edward P. Jones, I think he's just um, so good at animating contradiction and complexities, but then he'll like slow down moments in the narrative where he really reveals vulnerability of his characters. And there's definitely passages that I read again and again, just because it inspires me to try harder, to really, yeah, just try to go deeper into my characters and sort of finding the weak joints and kind of the vulnerable spots,
Mhm.
because that might be where I find something.
Totally. Yeah. So it seems like you use the story like a roadmap for not just only the relationship between like animals and people, but just like emotional beats and character and all of that. Are there any other stories in particular that that influenced your approach to writing or
Well, also, Aunt Hager's children, I also love a lot. And there's a story in here called Blindsided. And it's about a woman named Roxanne who's suddenly struck blind on a bus and sort of her acceptance of having this disability befall her. And at the end, there's just this amazing passage where she sort of begins to see herself again
Mhm.
as a blind woman. And it's really, but there's, I think one of the things about Edward P. Jones, and it's true in Lost in the City, there's so much emotion. Like he doesn't hold back. And one of my writers in graduate school was the Australian writer Peter Carey,
Mhm.
and he defined storytelling as a heightened sense of being alive. And that's what I experience when I read Edward P. Jones. His characters live on the page in these, I don't know, like there's so much vibrancy. I feel like he gives us so much as readers. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's definitely like he's a writer like Alice Munro and William Trevor, that I think a lot of writers, he's very much, I'm not alone in my admiration of him. I think a lot of writers uh, just turn to his stories and his novel as something to aspire to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think any whether it be a book or a movie or any form of storytelling that reminds me of what it's like to be alive and why it's wonderful and crazy and just all of that. If I walk away thinking that from a book, like it's done its job and I love it.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that's interesting about Edward P. Jones is that he grew up in the ghetto in Washington, D.C., and his mom was illiterate. And there's an essay actually after I heard him read that one time at Barnes and Noble.
mhm,
There was an essay published in the Washington Post in the summer of 1994 where he kind of used his addresses of all the different places he lived with his mom and sister, and it's sort of a miracle that he went to Holy Cross. He's one of the first African Americans to go to Holy Cross,
oh wow.
and that's where he began to write, and just what he overcame
Mhm.
to become a writer. And I think it reminds me that as hard as writing is, it is a privilege, and that we're given different opportunities. And one of the opportunities I was given is I got to go to the writing program at NYU, where that's where I studied with Peter Carey
Mhm.
and Mona Simpson and E.L. Doctorow. And all three of those writers really influenced me. But I think what happened after that program, it sort of, I knew I had to like keep going to readings and hearing other writers. And so it was during that time after grad school that I first discovered Jones. And yeah, I haven't, he came to Austin where I live, Austin, Texas.
Mhm.
There's a MFA program here called the Michener Center, and he visited, but unfortunately I wasn't able to make it. So I've
Oh,
only seen him once.
uh-huh.
And he doesn't really do that many. He's not a very extroverted writer, which is fine.
Mhm.
But there's not a lot of opportunities to see him.
Right. Yeah, well, it's amazing that you got to see him once.
Yeah.
Um, so are there is this unique in that you revisit it often? Do you often revisit books that have influenced you, or you do? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like Alice Munro is another favorite. Cole Toybin, the Irish writer, I
Mhm.
really love his writing. William Trevor, Lori Moore, and Who Will Run the Frog Hospital was her coming of age novel. I probably read it 5 times. It's a slim novel, but if a work kind of inspires me, I will read it again and again. I also teach, so I will return to certain authors when I'm teaching. But I would say a lot of my rereading is to inform my own writing,
Right. Mhm.
and it's also one of I've also worked as a book reviewer, and so I do enjoy kind of unpacking why something works, and to kind of look at a writer who, to me, is brilliant, like, to kind of see. And with Edward P. Jones, there's kind of, what I described earlier of how the characters, past, present, and future, can kind of all be in
Right.
scene. I
Mhm.
think it's really hard to do, and he makes it look easy. And a friend of mine once said to me that he had heard Edward P. Jones say, "You need to have 6 good reasons to have a flashback." And
Yeah.
yeah, because they can kind of take the air out of the scene or the narrative. And
Mhm.
with his work, you never feel like you're in flashback because he's always moving around.
Right.
He really, there's a lot of elasticity in his narratives. And with the Elephant of Belfast, I wouldn't say I did that myself, but it was something that helped inform, yeah, just the possibilities. And I used the close third person, but I did move around a little bit at the beginning of the novel and then midway through. And I think it was writers like him that sort of inspired me to take more risks with my own storytelling.
Right. And that's what all the best of them do, like inspire us to take risks. So,
Yeah,
congratulations on your release of your book. And thank you so much for being on.
sure. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. Join the conversation at withoutbooks.com.